There he is. How you doing, Ashley?
Hey, I'm good.
All right, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Davis. I'm the CTO of Sortle, and we're a business that's helping companies manage their digital assets with machine learning. I've also written a book called Data Wrangling with JavaScript, and that was my first book, and my second book is about to be published as well. So that's called Bootstrapping Microservices. So if you're looking to get into microservices, and this book is a very practical project-based guide for doing that, and it's got examples in JavaScript and Node.js. So this talk isn't about that, but I'm going to have a link at the end for anyone who's interested in learning microservices. Hope everyone's doing okay. Some pretty difficult times at the moment with this awful pandemic. I'm so grateful, Kevin, that you're continuing to keep BrisJS running. It's such a valuable thing to have. And also thanks, Aaron. That was a really interesting talk on WebAssembly, and I'm looking forward. I've got some motivation now to kind of look a bit deeper into that and see what I can find. Okay, I'm going to share screen now just so you can see what I'm looking at. Hopefully everyone can see that. So this phrase, to reinvent the wheel, just for anyone who hasn't heard it before, I'll just give a brief explanation. It means to rebuild something that has already been built before. And the connotation is that reinventing something is pointless and it's a waste of time. Somebody's already done it before. Why are you doing it again? So in general, this is a warning, a good warning. And you should be really, really careful where you invest your time and your focus. So in this talk, I want to explore a little bit about when it's okay to reinvent the wheel. And I'm going to show you my new open source project called MiniQL. So just a bit of background first. To make a long story short, I really like GraphQL. I think it's pretty awesome, but it didn't really fit my needs. So a few weeks back, after many months of thinking about it, I actually set out to create my own query language, and that's what I've called MiniQL. It's pretty much like GraphQL, it's just a lot smaller. Now, I had some good reasons for doing this, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And I can assure you it's not just because I'm crazy. I'm a little bit crazy, so there is that. But it is small, it's tiny. It's, I implemented the core query engine in TypeScript in a very short amount of time. And I've actually put a lot more effort so far into examples and documentation than I have for the code. So that sort of explains how small it is, and it's quite abstract, and it's quite difficult to explain, and that's why it's kind of a bit of an investment actually getting examples working and to get documentation around it. So after all this experience, the last few weeks of putting this together, I just wanted to talk a little bit about it, tell you why I did it, give you a bit of a demo, and just give you a brief look at the code. We're not going to have time to look at too much code. So first of all, if you haven't heard of it yet, a little bit about GraphQL. These are the facts at a glance. GraphQL is a language to query and manipulate data. It's very popular. It's created by Facebook. It's open source. There's a link on the slide there in case you want to learn more about GraphQL, and I'll repeat this link on the last slide as well. So if you thought that I didn't like GraphQL, you're quite wrong. I mean, I think it's actually quite incredible. And I wanted to use GraphQL so much that I decided to lovingly rewrite the parts of it that work best for me. So why didn't I use GraphQL? Well, there's definitely a time and a place for GraphQL. I've seen it work really well when I was contracting last year. But I tried to implement it this year for my startup, and it just didn't fit. Now, the first problem was having to have a schema. So, I run a startup, and we need to rapidly evolve and iterate our product. So we can experiment and we can find the best possible product for our customers. So one of my aims in this effort is it's sort of an ongoing effort, really, to reduce the cost of experimentation. And not using a schema really helps with that, because the cost of just defining a schema and updating it as the data evolves, when you don't really know where the data is going to go yet, and all the database migrations that you normally need for, like, traditional data schemas, that's just a headache that I don't need and I don't want. And also, it's a microservices application that I'm working on, so I don't want to have a schema for every microservice. So when it came time to put this massive schema together, I just had to say no to GraphQL, unfortunately, because it is really good and there's a lot there that's really useful. Now, there's some other issues as well. So GraphQL adds an extra language. It's got its own query language, and I didn't want to add that extra complexity to our stack. I mean, all things considered, it's not a big deal. It's not a big issue, but given the choice not to add a new language to our tech, I prefer not to. Also, GraphQL is quite big and complicated. It takes time to learn. It takes time to implement. Another thing I didn't like about GraphQL is I found it really tedious that you have to ask for all the data you want. Now, I know that's a performance thing, that you only get back the set of data that you really care about, but I really wanted just to be able to get all data back, by default, and then to have it optimized as well as an option. But by default, I want to be able to explore my data. I want to be able to see everything that's there. So for me and my startup, the barrier to entry for GraphQL was too high. And that really got me thinking about what it would take to recreate it in some minimal form. And this leads to the most important question in the talk, and that's, when is it okay to reinvent the wheel? We're often told that reinventing wheels is a bad thing. Some people say that we should never do that. Generally it's a good principle. It keeps you out of trouble, keeps you wasting your time. But consider this. If no one ever reinvented anything, we'd never have better things. We'd be stuck using the same tired old programming languages, databases, operating systems, that sort of thing. So there are times when reinventing the wheel is necessary for, like, innovation and evolution, and sometimes revolution. But unfortunately, we only ever really see that in hindsight. So when you make a better wheel and it's successful, you're going to be praised for that. You're going to have people, heaping praise on you. But the only way to get to that success is to make it past anyone who's telling you that you shouldn't be reinventing wheels. Another reason is that the existing wheel doesn't do what you want. So you need to make something that does work the way you need it to work. This is exactly what happened to me. So, GraphQL didn't fit my needs. And so I had to create my own small query language. You could also be motivated to build a better wheel. Personally, I don't think I could build something that's better than GraphQL. It's pretty good. So that's not really my motivation. But if you think you could reinvent something and surpass the limitations of what came before, well, that's motivation for reinventing the wheel. And of course, it's perfectly okay to reinvent things for fun or education. And this is actually a really great way to learn as a developer and get a lot more experience. So pick some technology that you really like and try to make your own version. You probably find along the way that it's really hard and you can't actually do it because it's just too much work for one person, or it's going to take too long. But that's perfectly okay as well. I think it's perfectly okay if you're a hobbyist programmer or doing programming on the side of your day job, that you get into a project and as soon as the value runs out, you just drop it, just get rid of it. If you've had some fun, if you've learned something, it was worth it. Move on, it's okay. But just don't do this on work time. So if you're at work trying to reinvent GraphQL, I work for myself, so it's all good. But if you're working in a traditional development job, just be careful when you do this, because it might not look too good for you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to my new open source project, MiniQL. It's a tiny JSON-based query language inspired by GraphQL. And obviously this was born out of the desire for me to use GraphQL, but not being able to use it because of my circumstances. MiniQL is implemented in TypeScript, but it's compiled to JavaScript, so you can use it from any JavaScript or TypeScript code. The query language, of course, is just JSON. So it's possible in the future that you might see MiniQL implementations in other languages other than TypeScript. Like there's no reason why this couldn't be implemented in, Python or Java or Ruby or Go or whatever. So MiniQL doesn't force you to define a schema. I'll talk about schemas again just in a moment, but by default, you don't have to provide any kind of schema. And all the fields of your data set are returned by default. One of the things that was really important for me for MiniQL was keeping it small. And because of that, many features are delegated to the back end. So whatever database you happen to be using in the back end, you can make use of its special features like for search, query, pagination, anything like that. That kind of works like GraphQL, where it delegates a lot of the work to the back end. So you can customize that however you like. My first implementation of MiniQL works in both Node.js and the browser, and I'm about to show you some examples. So I might just zoom in a little bit. Hopefully it doesn't change this too much. What I'm showing you now is something I just sort of prepared over the last few days. It's the MiniQL interactive example. So this is an example that runs completely in browser using the MiniQL core engine and also the MiniQL inline add-on, which basically allows you to query against data that you've got in memory. This has got a really cool Star Wars data set that I downloaded from Kaggle. You can see down the bottom here, there's the data explorer. You can just hide that and show it if you want to. But this is where you can browse among Star Wars characters, species, and planets. There's a bit of a search option here. I already typed Darth Vader's name in there, so I'm just going to search for him. So you can see that there's some data here for Darth Vader. Okay, so now what we have on the left here basically is a bunch of sample queries. In the middle is the query editor. This is actually using Monaco editor that you find in Visual Studio Code. And it's using this is where I said I'd talk about schemas, because in this front end, I'm actually using a JSON schema so that if you type the wrong thing here, so if I type something here that's not supported, it gives me a little error. So that is actually a schema, but it's not something that's built into MiniQL. It's just something that's built into the editor here. So on the right here, we've got the query result. So I can run this query. Of course, it's already been run. And you can see we've pulled out of our spreadsheet, out of our CSV file, some data here on Darth Vader, some statistics about him, the planet he comes from, Tatooine, and his species, which is human. Now, there's a bunch of other queries here. So what this query is doing is I'm saying, get me a character entity of name Darth Vader. So that's how that's working. I'm going to open up the second query here. So this one's very similar, get me Darth Vader, but I want to resolve this time a sub-entity. So we're going to get Darth Vader's homeworld. So I'm just going to run this query. And you can see here, we've still got Darth Vader, but it's expanded his homeworld now so that we've actually got data on his homeworld. So if we look back in the data explorer for a moment, you can see that that data about Tatooine has basically come from that separate table there. Now, there's a bunch of other sort of queries here you can run. We're going to be running out of time, so I won't go too far into these. I'll put a link to this example on the last slide if you want to have a play with it yourself. There's an example here of a third nested query where it basically gets Darth Vader's homeworld, and then it pulls the complete set of characters that come from that homeworld. Actually, I'll just run that because it's pretty cool. So you can see down here now we've got 10 characters. We've got Luke Skywalker, C-3PO, Darth Vader, and so on. Now, there's a few other things you can do, like, we're getting a single species here, Jabba the Hutt species. This query, because it has no arguments here, it's going to get all species into an array. And this one here is a nested, another nested query that gets all species and also drills down to get their homeworlds. So this example is based on using React. Plain JavaScript, this isn't built in TypeScript, but it is using the MiniQL TypeScript library. I'm using Ant Design for the UI here and Tailwind. And I'll just show you the GitHub page. So it's on GitHub. If you want to have a go at running this example yourself, it's really simple. Just grab the code, npm install, npm instart, and you'll have an example that looks like this. I'll show you the actual MiniQL organization. So I've made an org for MiniQL on GitHub. So you can see there's a whole bunch of projects here that I've started. It is a work in progress. I'm pretty happy with the core engine, but all the examples and the add-on modules still have a bit of work to be done. This is the MiniQL repo itself. So you can see at the top here, there's a bunch of different examples. An example of using MiniQL with CSV files, using it with JSON files. There's a JavaScript notebook here. I'll show you that in a second. There's an example here of using it behind a REST API with Express and wrapping a MongoDB database. So a more complicated example there. Now, there's more work to be done on the documentation here, but there's plenty of examples to have a look at if you're interested. Let's just have a quick look at the code. So this is the, it's all in one file. It's pretty small. I mean, it started off probably just a handful of lines of code, and it's grown to almost 400 lines of code. But I mean, as far as things go, that's not that big really. So if you are interested in kind of understanding how a TypeScript project like this comes together, have a look through this. The code, some of the code is pretty abstract, but it was built using test-driven development. So if you actually look at the commits, here's the commit history. This is the first commit. So I started this basically from my TypeScript template, which is a project that I share on GitHub. I'll give you a link to that on the last slide. That's how I start any new TypeScript project. It's just a minimal kind of TypeScript project. And then from there, the whole thing was built basically through, writing tests, making the tests pass all the way to the end. So if you're really interested to see how a project like this evolves using TypeScript, test-driven development, you can go into any of these commits basically. There's a good one. Let's have a look at this one. So you can go into any of these commits. You can see how the code changed. And you can see the test that was added. So here's a test that was added, a test that we could retrieve multiple nested entities using the core engine. So there's a lot of stuff to look at there. I'm a little bit over time already. I just want to show you the example notebook. So this is a notebook that I published from DataForge Notebook. It starts just by loading some data and then doing a bit of a preview on it. And then we're doing some configuration here of MiniQL CSV. So that's a module that basically integrates CSV files, and you use this data structure here to kind of say how they relate to each other. And then you can run queries against that. So these are like the queries that we looked at in the interactive example. There's a query here that gets all species and the example of the JavaScript code to run that query, and then the result you get from it. And you can go through this whole notebook here, and there's plenty of other queries to look at. You can get to this, you can get to all this stuff from the MiniQL repo, which is the first link at the end. So it just starts with all these examples. So I think I'm basically done. I'll just leave you with a few resources to end up. The first one is the link to MiniQL GitHub, the repo with all the examples links in it. The next link is the interactive example. If you want to have a look at that, have a play with it, or get it running for yourself. And then there's a link to GraphQL if you want to learn more about GraphQL. There's a link to my TypeScript template. So this is how I start any new TypeScript project. It's really small, really minimal, pretty easy to understand what's happening there. And then finally, there's a link to my new book, Bootstrapping Microservices. So I've finished the first draft. I'm currently working through revisions, but already it's available on the early access program. So you can buy it. There is still time for you to give feedback as well if you want to influence the direction of this book and where it's going. And that's all I've got for the moment. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Ashley. That's amazing. Cool. All right, we do have a couple of questions. The first one being, can I apply MiniQL in places where I'm using GraphQL right now?
Cool. Sorry, lost me for a second. I'm just going to stop sharing. It's early days for MiniQL, and it may not cover, it probably doesn't cover all GraphQL cases. So it's like hard to know really without having like a specific scenario. But please reach out to me on Twitter. Send me a message on Twitter, AshleyDavis75 on Twitter. Tell me more about how you want to use it and how you're using GraphQL. And maybe that can help kind of steer this in a direction as well, because I haven't done that much work with GraphQL, just sort of briefly worked with it last year. Just enough really to know that, I needed something like that to simplify all the hundreds and hundreds of endpoints that I've got in my application. So that was one of my primary reasons for wanting to have GraphQL in the first place. But yeah, so it's still a work in progress. It'd be good to know a specific situation, and I could tell you how it might work in that situation.
Cool. The next question is, what are all the data sources supported at this time? And is that running in a query server?
So the core engine is just pure JavaScript. There's no servers, no nothing. So you can run this thing entirely in a browser, like what I showed with that interactive example. And what that was doing is I'm basically just loading, because it's all pre-compiled through the React scripts. I can just require in JSON files. So that's my data. My data is just inline JSON compiled into my application. And then I've got a module called MiniQL inline. So that's a separate module that you can install that basically just takes a JavaScript object that has sub-objects that are the entities. So it just basically wires it all up so that you can use MiniQL to query against inline data. So that's in-browser usage. What's most interesting to me is accessing it through a REST API. And that's really just a case of, there's an example of that in there as well that you can find using Express and MongoDB. And so that is the front end making a HTTP post request, and the body of the post request is your query. And then you have like one REST API using Express or whatever, like in the back end, that's then handling that request and plugging the query into MiniQL. But we've basically wrapped our MongoDB database in a MiniQL resolver. So it's like, there's like an adapter layer that basically communicates to your data source. So you can have any data source you want, any database, theoretically. I've only tried it with MongoDB, of course. But I do have modules up there that work with CSV files and JSON files. So that was sort of like my bootstrapping process. So it was going to be easier to kind of make a nice demo out of CSV and JSON files than it would be out of MongoDB, which is, it's a lot more work to make an application that has MongoDB in the back end, although I've done that as well now. So there's a whole bunch of different ways you can use it and different examples that show you different ways to use it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. More applause. Thank you again, mate. Okay.